All right, everybody. So, welcome back from Christmas break. Hope you had a nice break. We're able to relax a little bit. So, we're going to go ahead and get back into it. So, we've got there's a total of 7 units in human geography. So, we're on unit 4. This will take us about 3 weeks, I'm thinking, something like that. So, let's take a look at what we'll be doing for the next bit. And just so you know, the video is long on YouTube. This one is. At least half of it's going to be videos of other stuff. So there's like a Vice video and some explainers in there. So it's not all just me. And again, I would encourage you, you can bump the speed up of the video, and that might help you get through it a little bit quicker. So anyway, uh, it is longer, but there's a different reason for that. So all right, so what we'll be doing is looking at what we call political geography, and that is, how the world is situated politically. And so we're going to start off with looking at how we define a state and different forms of things like that, things that shape contemporary political geography, concepts of power and territoriality, function and types of political boundaries. You can read all these, but so this is what's coming up for the next few weeks. All righty. And these are the units that go along with them. So we got 10 altogether. This is going to be unit 4.1. We're just doing this one singular one today. But by making this a longer one, we're going to be able to shorten up some of these other ones. So we'll be chunking several of these together. So, but anyway, you can see the titles of what's coming up here. So let's get into this one. So when we talk about political geography, you can see the learning objectives. And again, these are defined by AP. So the first one defined the different types of political entities. So we'll be doing that here in just a second, and then identify a contemporary example of of political entities. So we'll go over what they are, the terms. So these are going to be this is going to be where the vocabulary is going to be important for you, and then being able to state a specific example of a modern example of the concept. So here we go. Here's our essential knowledge, but we're about to do that. So when we talk about a state, all right, so this is our first term. What is a state? And so being here in the U.S., whenever we hear the term state, we always think like Arizona is a state, and California, and New York, and Illinois, and Florida. All those are states. And so for us, that's true. But when we're talking about political geography and global politics, a state is the term that's used to define what we would kind of call a country. All right. And so, in international terms, if we look at places like uh, Russia, Russia is a state. All right, Canada is a state. Germany is a state. It's a legal definition. All right, and so it is a political entity. Uh, and we're going to look at the things that make up a state. But so I want to make sure that you don't confuse when we use the term state in this class. Don't think of it as states within the United States of America. Think of it as countries. So those two terms, countries and states, kind of in the way we use them, are going to be a little bit synonymous. All right. But let's look at how we ended up getting to what we kind of our current political theory. And so in the early days, long time ago, we ended up with city states. All right, first it was nomadic, then they discovered farming, and so then we have people clustered in groups. Then we have this thing called a city state, which is a city with political and economic control over the surrounding countryside. And so a lot of those in world history. Uh, and sometimes city states would take over and they would form empires. All right, and so we were all familiar with like the Roman Empire is probably the biggest, the best example, or one of the best examples. And so that is a transnational thing. So we go from city states, where it's just one area with control over the locality, all the way to empires, which is transnational. All right, and so for a long time, political power was really based on the relationships between a leader and a group of people that were under that leader. It wasn't necessarily an allegiance to the state itself. It was uh, a dedication to the leader of that group. All right, and so not necessarily loyalty to a country, but loyalty to a person. A lot of times the borders were unclear or poorly defined, and that can be a big problem, as you can imagine. We'll get into borders in another unit here, but in the around the 18th century or so, European political philosophers came up with what we would kind of call a state today. The definitions of how we look at statehood today. So, or being a state. So when this came about, saw a couple of different things happen. So people started giving their allegiance to the state and the people of the state, not necessarily to the leader of the state. All right, if you were to ask people within the United States today, are you loyal to a leader or are you loyal to the country itself? The vast majority would say they're loyal to the country. All right, and so that's kind of a difference. Borders were drawn to formalize divisions between countries, so we get more official borders between countries, which does tend to cut down on conflict. Uh, and one of the negative offshoots of this, definitely, European countries started to impose these divisions on areas around the world as they colonized them. And so we'll look at Africa. The borders that were drawn in Africa were not drawn, well, we'll get into it. So anyway, so when we look at this progression, we start off, really it was kind of nomadic here, then we discover agriculture, then we have city states, goes to empires, and really today we look at that. It's states within the world. All right. So definition of a modern state today, and again, this is one of your terms to know, definitely. Again, in short, this is how we would use the word country. So let's look at these 5 things that make up a state. So these are the essential features. If a place can tick off all 5 of these, then we would say that they are indeed a state, a recognized political unit. So first, they have to have spatial extent. They have to exist in a place. They have to have a population. That makes sense. No states without people. Have to have defined borders. They have to have a sovereign government. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And then they also have to be recognized by other states. All right, and this is where we're going to run into some issues. So let's take a look at this real quick. So by spatial extent, we just mean they take up a physical space. And so the lower 48, as they call it, here's the United States. We are taking up a physical space. Canada is taking up a physical space. Mexico, physical space. So that's all that one means. All right. You can't have a a virtual country that doesn't take up any physical space. All right. It also has to have a population, obviously. The nature of the state's population definitely affects the state's stability. All right. And so if you look at a country like the U.S., I just use them because we're familiar with it. Uh, we are a pretty divided country right now, but we generally agree on the rules that we play by. We have a consensus, meaning that an agreement, that the Constitution of the United States is the fundamental law of the land. That's where all of this other stuff comes from. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, generally, there's exceptions, but generally, we all have this belief that the Constitution is our foundation of law, and everything that flows from that, we accept. All right. We have disagreements about it, don't get me wrong, but we all go back and say, hey, the Constitution says this. All right. We don't disregard that and say we're going to make it up anyway, do something different. All right. So the consensus is a big deal. And then mobility, within states, most people are mobile within states. All right. Not all states, but mostly so. All right. Have to have defined borders. So as we can see here, Venezuela has a defined border. Colombia has a defined border. Brazil has a defined border. Everybody agrees on these. These are internationally recognized borders. All right. So you can see down here, international boundary. And so that's what all these are. And so we can say, hey, these are the states. All right. And sometimes it can be a source of conflict, and we'll get into some of those a little bit later in a different section of this unit. But they have to have, this is another condition of being a state, they have to have something called sovereignty or self-determination. They kind of mean the same thing. So when we talk about political sovereignty, that is the idea that a country, where's my marker there? So political sovereignty, that the state can control their own destiny. All right. Nobody else can influence them and tell them what to do. So if you look at the United States, can another country legally tell us what to do? And the answer is no. If you look at Mexico, can another country tell them what to do legally? And the answer is no. All right. And so that's what we mean by political sovereignty. Now, clearly, that's not 100% accurate because there are states who are influenced by other countries. The U.S. loves to influence other countries. China right now loves to influence other countries. And so a lot of times it's either through military threats or money. Okay. help them out with building infrastructure, stuff like that. So, but for definition of the state, theoretically, they do have sovereignty or this thing called self-determination. All right. Whoops. And finally, they have to have a government. We do. Ours is the Constitution. The Constitution founded our government, but every state has to have some form of government. There are different types of government, and that's going to be, again, another section in this unit that we'll get into, but you have to have some type of government. All righty. Now, when we look at the number of states in the world today, that can be questioned. All right. Currently, it's generally recognized, and I say generally kind of loosely here, that there are 195 independent sovereign states that are recognized by the U.S. Okay, so that's what the U.S. looks out at the world and says, hey, there's 195, and so the United Nations, okay, also agrees. Now, notice this: there's 201 states with partial recognition, meaning that there are 6 other states out there that are going from 195 to 201. There's 6 other states out there that the U.S. doesn't recognize, but some other countries do. Palestine is going to be one of them, and we'll talk more about them in just a little bit. Whoops, sorry. We have de facto sovereign states. They are self-declared countries. If you look at the number of country codes, and there's 249 of those. If you look at FIFA, there are 211 countries eligible for the World Cup. The Olympics recognize 206 different countries, and so, you get the idea of about how many there are. But the technical definition, it depends on who you ask. All right. So when we look at, so that's the first part. So now we need to define these different types of political entities, and states are one of them. All right. And so that should be in here as number one. So states is the first one. Then we're going to go through and define nation states, stateless nations, multi-state nations, autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. So all of these are the vocabulary that you need to make sure you get from this video. All right. Now, again, I'm going to be showing different video clips of different areas of parts of the world. And again, this isn't necessarily going to be test material per se, but these are areas of the world where you should have an understanding of what's going on and what the overall issues are for these areas. All right. So anyway, I'll keep the questions short on those videos as we're watching this. But anyway, all right. So again, let's go through what it means to be a state, because this is our first definition. Again, spatial extent, got to take up space, have to have population, define borders, sovereign government. Another government can't tell them what to do, and recognized by other states. And so let's just go through. Is the United States an actual state? All right. Do we have a spatial extent? Yes. It looks something like that. And then we got Alaska way up here. All right. And so here's our spatial extent. Looks like a terrible tooth. But anyway, population, the fact that you and I are talking here, means that we do have a population. Define borders, definitely with Mexico and Canada. Sovereign government, other countries can't tell us what to do. Sorry. And we are definitely recognized by other states in the world. All right. So we can definitely check off that the United States is a state, an official state. All right. So now we want to talk about something called a nation. And this is where it's going to get a little more technical, and you need to make sure that you're clear with the words that you use, because we look at the United States and say, hey, we're a nation, but that's not quite right. All right. So let's look at the definition of a nation, because this is going to get a little more technical. So in general, a nation is a group of people that have a certain number of things in common. They have a cultural heritage, common cultural heritage. They have beliefs and values that help unify them. They claim a particular space based on the tradition as their homeland, and they have a desire to establish their own state or express self-determination in some other way. All right. Now, I will say this, depending on how tightly somebody applies these standards, we can say somebody is a nation or not. And so I should have said this in the beginning. These terms that we use, one of those was autonomous and semi-autonomous. A lot of this is going to be how you choose to define the context of what you're talking about, because you could argue, we'll talk about Hong Kong for a little bit. Is that an autonomous, semi-autonomous? Is it semi-autonomous or just not have any autonomy. We'll get into that, but just know in the beginning that these are debatable terms. All right. So when we say, is the U.S. a nation? You could have somebody reasonably argue the U.S. is a nation based on these things, and you could also have somebody reasonably argue that it's not. And so we're going to go through and give specific examples that are much more clear, okay, less ambiguous than other stuff. So keep that in the back of your mind. So I wanted to bring your attention to this map called Kurdistan. Hopefully everybody's heard of Kurdistan. And if you are shaking your head no, that's good because it's not actually a country, okay? There is an ethnic group called the Kurds, and this is where they wanted their country to be, but it's not one, all right? Now, they do share a common cultural heritage. They do share the similar beliefs and values. They do claim a particular space, that one, and they have a desire for self-determination. The Kurds were a huge help to us in fighting uh, against ISIS. We kind of turned on them a little bit and cut them loose, but that's another story. But so we would look at the Kurds today, and this is in the Middle East. So you can see, just to give you some context here, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey's up here. So you get a sense we're in the Middle East. But so we would say that the Kurds make up a nation, but they don't actually they're not a state. They're not a political unit that's recognized. All right. And so what I want to do, we're going to look at the Kurds, and then Israel and Palestine. Whoops, sorry. Shoot. Israel and Palestine, and hang on just a sec. Let me pause this and figure out what's going on. Okay, so I think this is going to work. Alrighty, so you get an idea of what we mean when we talk about a nation. The Kurds are definitely a nation, but as the video showed, they do not have uh, their own country. Alrighty, so let me switch back. Sorry, uh, and so that's the Kurds. And so again, make sure you're familiar with what that issue, with who the Kurds are. So let's go to this one. All right. And so this is looking at Israel and Palestine.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war. Yeah, big ask, Mr. Green. I mean, that fight goes back thousands and thousands of years. Except thousands of years ago, there wasn't an Islam yet. So yeah, no. Also, let me submit that very little of this conflict between Israel and Palestine over the last several decades has been about, like, theological differences between Islam and Judaism. No one's arguing about whether the most important prophets descended from Abraham's son Isaac or his son Ishmael, right? It's not about whether to fast during Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It's about land. Portraying the conflict as eternal or as religious makes it feel intractable in a way that, frankly, it isn't. So instead, let's begin, as most historians do, in the late 19th century. And instead of talking about religion, let's follow the lead of historians like James Gelvin and discuss competing nationalisms. Okay, so in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled over what we now know as Palestine. The population there, according to Ottoman records from 1878, was 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 3% Jewish. Everybody spoke Arabic as the daily language, and in Jerusalem, the religious populations were roughly equal. To give you a sense of life in Ottoman Palestine, an Arab Orthodox Christian musician named Wasif Jaharia grew up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, learning the Quran in school and celebrating both Passover and Eid with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Ottoman Palestine was, in short, a place in which people of different religious faiths lived peacefully together. All right, let's go to the problem. The late 19th century was the golden age of nationalism in Europe, and no place was crazier than the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which at least 10 different nations all wanted their own state. And in that hyper-nationalistic empire lived a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who had hoped that Jews could assimilate into European nations, but soon became convinced that the Jewish people needed to The concept of Jewish nationalism came to be known as Zionism. It's important to keep in mind that most Zionists were secular Jews, so they imagined Israel as a state for Jews more than a Jew decades before that, and now they live under what amounts to a military occupation. And that's all true. To Israel, the Jewish people clearly need a homeland, which the United Nations established. And they certainly aren't the first nation state to consolidate and increase their territory via military victory. And they need to protect their nation against the many active threats made against them by their neighbors. That's also true. It's important to understand the internal logic of these competing nationalist visions. For both Zionist and Palestinian national visions to eventually work, it's necessary to understand the right of each to exist and the legitimacy of each's historical narrative. But these problems aren't thousands of years old, and they aren't intractable. They emerged in the British Mandatory period. But let's hope that by understanding that this isn't an endless religious war, that we might be closer to seeing its end. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is filmed here in the Chad and Stacy Emicult studio in
Alrighty, let me see if I can fast forward this. Sorry.
Subscribers on Subbable.
Come on. All right, so you can kind of see when we're talking about nations. So is Palestine a nation? Definitely, because they share this cultural heritage and all the things that we listed out. But are they a state? Okay, because we've talked about what a state is and what a nation is, and so Israel and Palestine are clearly both nations. And when we talk about a state, if you take a look up here, let's look down here. If you take a look up here, these are the countries in 2018 that recognize Israel. And again, just so looking on a map, we're in this part of the world over here. All right, here's the Mediterranean. So, but anyway, and so when we look at Palestine, this is what they would claim. This is the West Bank, and this is the Gaza Strip. And so Palestine says, look, this is our territory. This is the nation of Palestine, and these countries agree with them. All right, and so in 2018, the countries in green here agreed with Palestinians to say, look, we recognize you as a country. All right, and then up here, 2018, these are the countries that look at Israel and say, we recognize you as a country. And so again, this is one of those things when we talk about recognition of countries and how many countries there are. That can be a little bit different. There can be some other things to it. Alrighty. So just a couple other examples of nations. The Kurds, we talked about them. The Scottish, so the people in Scotland, they are trying to become independent or starting to try to become. The Lakota Sioux in the United States, people in Tibet, the Basque region of Spain, that's over here. They have their own culture. They're kind of an autonomous unit within Spain. We'll get to that. Here's the Lakota Sioux in the United States. Here's Scotland within the United Kingdom. And so these are, again, all cultural groups that we would say they're a nation, but they don't have their own political borders. They're not a political unit. All righty. So now we get to this thing called a nation state. And the two big examples here, and remember, you need to remember the examples as well, are Japan. We'll point them out. So here's Japan over here, and Iceland, which is here. All right, so just to give you some context here. So when we talk about a nation state, and these are the two terms that we've just talked about, and we're just going to combine them together. A nation state is a country whose political boundaries correspond with the cultural boundaries. All right, and so when you look at Iceland, Iceland was settled by Scandinavians. There was no indigenous culture in Iceland when the Scandinavians arrived. So it's not like when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, there was already an indigenous population. There wasn't one. There wasn't anybody living in Iceland when the Scandinavians got there. And so 94% of their population is Icelanders. All right. Japan has even more culturally homogenous. 99% of the total population are Japanese. All right. And so there's a strong political identity. Japan has strict immigration policies. And so they definitely fit the definition of a nation. Same with Iceland. And they also fit the political definition of a state. All right. So when we say a nation state, that's what we mean. We're combining those two terms. We would not say the United States is a nation state. We are just a state. All right. So that's that. Then we get to, and so now we're just going to play on those two terms, okay, the term state and the term nation. All right, and so The next example is what we call multinational states. And so these are states that are out there. So let's look at the United Kingdom first. All right. So UK is a state, it's a political unit, but they are made up of different groups. So here's Scotland, they have their own unique identity, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And so a multinational state would be several nations within a political state, within that political unit. If you look at the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, they had 185 different ethnic groups. And again, how we define multinational makes a difference here, because you could look at the US and argue that we have definitely different ethnic groups within the US. And so could somebody make an argument that the US is a multinational state? Probably. But it's not the example you need to be thinking of. All right. The former Soviet Union is definitely one. So here you can see this whole area was the former Soviet Union. And so you have different groups within here. Kazakhstan is in here. Ukraine is in here. Estonia, Latvia. There's a bunch of different countries, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. So there's a lot of different nationalities within the country of the Soviet Union. Okay, obviously today the Soviet Union's gone, and those countries are now, a lot of those places are their own states. Okay, they'd always been nations, but now they are their own states. So when we look at Russia and the Soviet Union, there's clearly a lot of history there. And so there's a place called Ukraine, all right, and that used to belong to the Soviet Union, and now it's its own independent country or independent state. And there's a place in Ukraine called Crimea, which is at the bottom. And so let's see if I got, sorry. So let's see, I think I need to, I'm having trouble determining whether you can see the video or if you're still looking at the PowerPoint. So hang on just a second. I think it's playing. If not, I apologize. So actually, you know what? Let's skip this one for now. Maybe we'll watch this in class. Okay, so anyway, lost myself here. Okay, so that was a multinational state, all right? And now we have something called a multi-state nation. Here again, we've got the Kurds, because this is saying, look, here's a nation, so here's the nation of the Kurds, here's where the Kurds live, but they don't have, their nation is within different states, all righty? So this is definitely one of the examples to use for a multi-state nation. Remember, nation doesn't have political boundaries, recognized political boundaries, but a nation is this cultural group, and so a multi-state nation is within different states or different countries, all right? And so North and South Korea would be another example here. The Korean people, we would argue that they are very similar, same heritage, same culture generally. And some people might start to argue that North and South Korea are very different now. The people are very different. But for the most part, this is one of the examples to remember. So this is one nation, the Korean nation, but it's within two different states, all right, of North Korea and South Korea. And so, yeah, we'll leave it at that. Then we have what we call a stateless nation. And again, the Kurds fit this. So when an ethnicity has a history of self-determination, but does not have a recognized state, all right? And so here's the Kurds, we just did that. Other examples, this is Palestine, and then Catalonia, Spain. We're gonna watch some on them here now. So let's do that. It's only 5 minutes.
We are a territory with a strong national personality. We need our independence.
Hay mucha más gente que somos españoles y queremos pertenecer a España.
Spain is in the middle of a political battle that threatens to split the country. the region of Catalonia held a referendum to decide if they wanted to become an independent state and therefore separate from Spain. The Spanish constitutional courts ruled the referendum illegal, and the central government tried to stop it from happening. They arrested government officials who were planning on holding the vote, confiscated ballots, and closed polling stations. Undeterred, the regional Catalan government announced that voters could print their ballots at home and vote at any open polling station. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Nearly 1,000 people were injured in the violence, 5 of them seriously. As for the results, 90% of participants voted to secede. This would seem like almost unanimous approval, but less than half of all eligible voters in Catalonia turned out to vote. Based on the results, the Catalan government is threatening to declare independence from Spain unilaterally. In response, the Spanish government is preparing an unprecedented takeover of Catalonia's regional powers, which will remove its leaders from office. So how did they get here? Spain is made up of 17 semi-autonomous regions, each with their own identity. Some, like Catalonia, are distinct enough that they have their own language as well as culture, cuisine, and literature. Spain is a decentralized, unified state. That means that autonomous regions like Catalonia are governed according to the national constitution, as well as laws enacted independently by each regional government. But it wasn't always this way. From 1939 to 1975, Spain lived under a fascist dictatorship. Francisco Franco eliminated democratic liberties, freedom of the press, and political opposition. He also crushed regional diversity around the country to impose a single national identity. For Catalonia, that meant suppressing the Catalan language as well as local traditions. It was a big blow to the Catalan culture. When Franco died in 1975, Spain transitioned into a democracy, and the newly created constitution expanded autonomy in the regions. The constitution allowed for a few things: Catalonia's self-governance, it recognized Catalan as an official language of Catalonia, and while specifically recognizing autonomy in the regions that comprise Spain, it also cemented that Spain was indivisible. As Spain's democracy strengthened, so did Catalonia's pride.
We are Catalan, we feel Catalan, we speak Catalan, and it is another culture.
Then, for the first time since the constitution was created, Catalans tried to expand their autonomy. The 2006 referendum called for many things. It called for a new economic model for Catalonia, to define Catalonia as a nation, and to privilege the Catalan language over Spanish. After 4 years of legal battles, the Constitutional Court struck down some of the amendments. When the constitutional ruling was announced, 1 million Catalans went to the streets of Barcelona, where they carried signs that read, "We are a nation, we decide." There are economic motivations for independence too. Catalonia is one of the most prosperous regions in Spain. It takes up only 6% of the country, but it accounts for 1/5 of Spain's economic output. In 2016, nearly 21% of Spain's tax revenue came from Catalonia.
We pay a lot of taxes. They take them away. They don't return into better infrastructures, into better living conditions.
Pro-independence Catalans believe Catalonia pays too much money into the central government compared to what it gets in return. Catalonia, like Madrid and other richer regions, support the poorer parts of Spain. This sentiment grew during the European economic crisis, when a wave of unemployment hit Spain. But despite growing support, the majority of Catalans don't want independence.
No me parece que sea bueno para Cataluña la independencia, no por depender o no de España, sino porque dependemos directamente de Europa.
Low-income families are less likely to support independence than those who are well off, as are Catalans who live in cities compared to those who live in rural areas. Which brings us back to today. Banks and multinationals have started to move their headquarters out of Barcelona to other Spanish regions. Catalan separatists have turned to Europe for support, but most European Union leaders have sided with the central government. They have made it clear that an independent Catalonia would have to apply for EU membership, a process that would take years. And while the fight on Catalan independence will eventually be settled, it may take a long time for Catalonia and Spain to return to peaceful coexistence.
Alrighty. So, almost done. So we can get off of this. All right. So that is, again, looking at what they call a stateless nation. So the people of Catalonia would say, hey, look, we're a nation without a state. And so they're trying to get that independence and become their own independent state. A lot of them are. Not all the people within Catalonia want to do that. But all right, the last little bit is what we call autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. And we can get an idea of both of these with this one map. So we're going to look at Hong Kong and we'll look at Taiwan. So these are all parts of China. So this is mainland China here. And so when we think about semi-autonomous regions, you can kind of think about, states within the United States. So, the state of Arizona has some autonomy. We have what we call a federalist system, meaning power is shared between the federal government and the state governments. And so, we have some level of autonomy within Arizona. But we're talking about something a little bit different here. But so let's take a look at both of these and what the definitions are. So an autonomous region is defined. These are defined areas inside of a state, usually regions that have a certain degree of autonomy from external authority, so they can kind of do what they want without somebody else telling them what to do. It's not complete by any stretch, but they do have a fair amount of independence. Not complete independence, but a fair amount of it. Areas have power of their own affairs. So let's look at, So let's look at Taiwan. Here's a couple of political cartoons about Taiwan. And so I do want to show you, we'll come back to this. I should have reordered those slides. But let's look at what Taiwan is all about and why it's a little bit controversial. This isn't a very long video either, it's 5 minutes.
Part of its territory. To China, it's an inalienable part of its territory. But for many in Taiwan, there's a growing sense of national identity. Compared to China, Taiwan is tiny. It's not even 1,000th of China's landmass, and its population isn't even 2% of the mainland's. But while the self-governing island only has 17 countries that officially recognise it, its quasi-nation status provokes intense angst within China's ruling Communist Party. The uneasy peace that has prevailed since Taiwan split from mainland China in the wake of the country's civil war in 1949 appears to be on precarious ground. Beijing has been ramping up a relentless campaign to try and persuade countries and businesses alike to accept Taiwan is a part of China. And earlier this year, Qantas was one of many airlines who bowed to Chinese pressure to label Taiwan a territory and not a country. So why is China so sensitive about this tiny little island? Taiwan's armed forces pales in comparison to Beijing's military might. And Taiwan's highly developed economy is still a mismatch against the world's second biggest. So the global superpower should have nothing to fear, right? Well, not so fast. Experts say the reason Taiwan produces such intense anxiety amongst China's ruling elite is because it represents a vision of what the mainland could be, a thriving, progressive democracy of ethnic Chinese. And that vision could be an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing expends untold amounts of energy at preserving one-party rule by tracking and cracking down on dissent. And Taiwan's emerging status as one of Asia's leading democracies poses a direct challenge to the authoritarian regime in Beijing. And Taiwan is not alone. Hong Kong, a former British colony, returned to China in 1997 under the principle of one country, two systems. But its democratic ambitions appear to have Beijing hot under the collar. When China announced in 2014 that it would be vetoing candidates in Hong Kong's democratic election for its leader in 2017, a resistance was born. A pro-democracy protests known as the Umbrella Movement sprung up in defiance.
Really divided the protesters because most people here are saying let this traffic go through.
But it was forcefully suppressed, and many of its leaders are now on trial. Many in Hong Kong now sense Beijing is breaking its promise of one country, two systems, and is instead in the midst of a prolonged meddling in Hong Kong's affairs, with an eventual goal of assimilation. But the resolve of pro-independence movements in Taiwan will only be strengthened by the deterioration of democratic ambitions in Hong Kong. And soon, that resolve will be put to the test. Taiwan is about to go to the polls for its midterm elections. And the vote will be a test for the country's independence-leaning government. Also among the issues at stake is a referendum for the name Taiwan to be officially used at the Olympics, instead of the Beijing-approved Chinese Taipei. Now, it may not sound like a big deal, but to anxious minds in Beijing, that move would demonstrate Taiwan asserting its autonomy. But beyond the midterms, this contentious territorial dispute is expected to rear its head up again and again and again. And if recent times are to be any indication of what's to come, Beijing seems determined to maintain control of the narrative and keep both Taiwan and Hong Kong well within its boundaries.
Okay, so you can see, again, when we talk about autonomous and semi-autonomous regions, it is the degree to that autonomy. And so there's no one hard and fast line to say, hey, this one's semi-autonomous and this one's autonomous. But when we look at those two, Taiwan and Hong Kong, Taiwan is definitely more autonomous than Hong Kong, and they each have their own issues surrounding their level of autonomy and why China might like to rein that autonomy in some. Again, semi-autonomous, same kind of thing, but they just have less control. All right. And so Native American reservations in the U.S., we've got one more video, then we're done, are an example of a semi-autonomous region, because within Indian nations, they have their own set of laws, but they are within the framework of U.S. federal law. All right. And so let's watch that, and then we'll be done. So again, this distinction between semi and fully autonomous is just, how people choose to define where that line is. There's no one hard and fast line. So let's take a look at this last video, not very long, and then we will be done. And sorry for the long one, but we'll be able to, once you have this background knowledge, we'll be able to do a lot more with that coming up shortly. So here's the last one.
Relationship with the many tribes, a series of...
So 3.5 minutes.
Since European settlement began in 1492, Native Americans in the United States have seen their cultures wiped out, their land taken, and even what some have called a genocide of their people. Millions of deaths, alongside a subhuman legal status, crippled the Native American population and contributed to high rates of substance abuse, poverty, and suicide. But in recent years, the United States government has made efforts to grant Native Americans some level of autonomy by classing tribal land as a separate, self-governing government. So just how independent are Native American reservations? Well, throughout the 19th century, Native Americans were rounded up and sent to specific plots of land known as reservations, as per the Indian Removal Act of 1830. As the United States government fine-tuned their relationship with the many tribes, a series of court cases named after Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall delegated sovereign authority to these reservations. What this means is that under federal law, each reservation is its own distinct nation with limited dependence on the U.S. government and the state within which they are located. This domestic dependency relationship gives these independent tribes control over their territory. They can levy taxes on tribal members and even hold court cases with legal punishments. They also have to pay U.S. federal income taxes, but not necessarily state sales tax, depending on the reservation. In return, the U.S. government is tasked with protecting and upholding tribal resources and self-governance. This separated but dependent relationship explains how some reservations are federally allowed to build casinos or grow marijuana, as they are considered distinct from their surrounding state. However, out of a total population of about 5 million Native Americans in the United States, only about 22% live on reservations. Still, despite existing as sovereign nations, the land those reservations are on is still technically owned by either the federal or state government. It is held in a trust on behalf of whichever tribe lives on it. Additionally, because these tribes are both subject to federal law and benefit from special concessions within it, it would be hard to say that tribal reservations have unlimited sovereign power. For example, the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act acknowledged that the federal government had long infringed on Native Americans' freedom of religion, as delegated in the First Amendment. In an effort to fix this, special rights were granted, allowing access to historical religious sites and the use of sacred objects which may be legally prohibited or regulated otherwise. In fact, a 1994 addendum to the act specifically approved the use of peyote, an illegal hallucinogenic drug, in spiritual ceremonies. In the end, it's difficult to say how independent Native American reservations are from the United States. The process by which tribes first received any form of rights, continuing on to special concessions and eventually quasi-sovereignty, is narrow and complicated. By some measures, tribal reservations are not only subject to the United States, but federally owned by them. In other ways, they are intentionally and distinctly treated as foreign autonomous territories. So which is it? Realistically, both. The U.S. federal government has taken some measures to help Native Americans counteract centuries of injustice. Find out more in the video at the top. And check out the video at the bottom to learn about what the first Thanksgiving was all about and what Americans get wrong about the holiday. Thanks for watching. If you don't want to miss out on more test tube news, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you get all of our relationship with.
Okay, so that's it. I will see everybody later, and hope it wasn't too long for you.